Tonight, Britain stands on the edge of something it's never faced before. The King has spoken, and when a monarch breaks centuries of silence, you know the storm has finally hit home. Just moments ago, King Charles reportedly demanded a false emergency review of the £2.4 billion scandal that's tearing his government apart. The palace may deny it, but whispers inside Westminster say the King has lost all confidence in Prime Minister Keir Starmer after the corruption files linked directly to Downing Street. The question echoing through Parliament right now, is the Crown about to turn against its own government? For months, the rumours spread like smoke in an old theatre, invisible at first, then choking everyone inside. The £2.4 billion scandal was supposed to be buried under layers of bureaucracy, sealed off by legal jargon and quiet bribes. But tonight, those walls are cracking. Inside the marble corridors of Westminster, ministers are whispering that King Charles himself has intervened. Not as a monarch bound by neutrality, but as a man furious that his nation's name has been sold to the highest bidder. Sources close to the palace claim that earlier this morning, the King received a private dossier from a retired intelligence officer. Inside were details that even Parliament hadn't seen. Encrypted bank transfers, internal memos, and a signature allegedly linking Starmer's top advisor to the Westbridge contract scandal. It's no longer speculation, it's confrontation. The palace, once silent, is now the quiet eye of a political hurricane. They're not issuing statements, not denying, not confirming, just waiting as the flames of outrage lick the gates of Westminster. Because when the monarch of a constitutional democracy starts asking questions about his own government's integrity, it's not ceremony anymore, it's crisis. And tonight, that crisis has a name: Keir Starmer. The whispers began with a phone call, one the Prime Minister wasn't supposed to take. Around midnight, according to insiders, a senior palace official contacted Downing Street requesting a full briefing on the financial irregularities linked to the migrant housing contracts. In plain English, the King wanted answers. But here's where it gets darker. Starmer's team reportedly tried to delay the call, citing national security sensitivity. National security? For housing contracts. The excuse was so thin, it only made the question louder. Well, what exactly is the government hiding from the Crown? By dawn, Parliament was in uproar. Opposition MPs demanded to know why the palace was being kept in the dark about the most expensive scandal in modern British history. The Speaker called for order, but order left the chamber hours ago. What replaced it was chaos, shouting, paper throwing, and one name repeated over and over again: Westbridge. It's the same name that's haunted every corner of this scandal, a construction firm turned political weapon, funneling millions into campaign coffers, rewarded with contracts worth hundreds of millions more. And now, for the first time, that web of corruption has reached Buckingham Palace's doorstep. One senior Tory MP told reporters, if the King really has spoken, it's over. The public won't forgive a government that's lost the trust of the Crown. That's not just political theatre, though, that's the quiet sound of the system breaking. The very institution that symbolises unity now stands opposite the one that claims to lead. It's a collision course no one thought they'd live to see. And the irony, the scandal that caused it wasn't about war or espionage, it was about homes. Homes promised to veterans, to pensioners, to families who built this country brick by brick. Sold off, cleared out, repurposed, all under the disguise of compassion. The King's fury reportedly stems from one thing: betrayal. Not of politics, but of people. He's spent decades championing causes for the homeless, the forgotten, the overlooked. To discover that 15,000 social homes were emptied to build resettlement zones tied to government kickbacks, that's not just a policy failure, it's moral collapse. Inside the palace, aides say His Majesty's private words were simple but sharp. This is not Britain. But if this isn't Britain anymore, then what is it? Meanwhile, Starmer's office is crumbling from within. 2 senior advisors have resigned since the King's alleged inquiry. One was seen leaving number 10 carrying a single briefcase, so not a word to the press, just a look that said everything. The other reportedly handed in her resignation letter with the phrase, "I won't lie for power." These aren't ordinary resignations, they're alarms. When the people closest to the Prime Minister start jumping ship, it's because they see what's coming, a reckoning. Across the nation, protests are swelling again. Outside Parliament, crowds chant, not just for justice, but for truth. "The King knows," read one banner. "Britain betrayed," screamed another. The sound isn't just noise anymore, it's momentum. The streets are turning into the real Parliament, the people into the real opposition. Even news anchors, once cautious, are now asking live on air, did the King just declare war on corruption? Inside the palace, the lights are still on. Inside number 10, the blinds are shut. 2 buildings, 1 country, and a silence that feels like thunder before the strike. But if this really is the moment King Charles has chosen to step off the sidelines, if he's truly decided to speak for the nation, then Britain isn't just witnessing scandal anymore. It's witnessing history, because when the King moves, the ground shifts. And if that's true, then what happens next when the Crown itself turns its gaze on the Prime Minister? By the next morning, Britain felt like a shaken snow globe. Everything familiar still there, but scattered in chaos. Parliament was no longer a place of debate. It had become an arena of survival. Every corridor buzzed with one question. What did the King really say? No official statement came from Buckingham Palace, but silence in politics is louder than speech. Ministers were pale, aides avoided cameras, and even journalists whispered about the briefing, a private document rumoured to have been hand-delivered to the King by a senior MI5 liaison. It contained the clearest proof yet that the £2.4 billion housing scheme wasn't a humanitarian project at all. It was a laundering channel. Contracts awarded to companies tied to Starmer's political donors, invoices inflated by millions, and documents showing public funds rerouted to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The numbers weren't red, they were radioactive. In Westminster, fear turned into fracture. Cabinet members began distancing themselves from Starmer's circle, each one rehearsing lines of denial before cameras rolled. But the truth had already escaped. Leaked copies of the King's concern memorandum, as insiders called it, spread through encrypted journalist networks within hours. The text, polite yet piercing, allegedly read, "When trust is lost between those who govern and those they serve, the foundations of our nation tremble." Those words hit harder than any headline. It was royal diplomacy translated into public indictment. For the first time in living memory, a British monarch had quietly questioned the moral fitness of his own government. Downing Street's response was pure panic, disguised as composure. Starmer's press secretary held a tense conference, brushing off questions about royal correspondence as fabricated gossip. But every denial only fed suspicion, because deep down, everyone knew the King wouldn't act without reason, and that reason, hidden in those classified financials, was enough to make even the Prime Minister's allies step back. Treasury officials reportedly refused to sign off on further project payments until an independent review could be completed. Billions frozen, deals paused. And the contractors at the centre of it, Westbridge, Brookline and Hanway Group, scrambled to erase traces of communication, servers wiped, emails deleted, phones lost. The digital smoke was rising faster than the government could contain it. On the streets, the mood had changed from anger to something colder. Resolve. Protesters now carried portraits of the King beside Union Jacks, chanting not against the Crown but alongside it. "Stand with the King," they shouted outside Westminster. For once, the monarchy wasn't the target of fury, it was the shield. That shift terrified Downing Street, because when people begin seeing the sovereign as the last honest voice in the system, the government loses its moral currency. Even conservative tabloids, usually loyal to the ruling party, began to tilt. Headlines read, "The King has spoken. Now who will answer?" And in that one question, Starmer's entire power began to collapse. Meanwhile, the whispers inside Whitehall turned venomous. Senior civil servants exchanged glances in corridors, aware that their internal memos might be tomorrow's headlines. The atmosphere was electric, half dread, half anticipation. And then came the most dangerous rumour yet, that the King had scheduled a private audience with the leader of the opposition. No cameras, no press, just a closed-door meeting that broke every unwritten rule of neutrality. If true, it meant the palace was preparing for what hadn't been uttered aloud in decades. Transition. The possibility that the monarch could quietly encourage a change in leadership under the cover of constitutional discretion. Starmer's inner circle went into lockdown. Phones confiscated, meetings moved to undisclosed locations, and a new strategy whispered through clenched teeth. Discredit the monarchy. Leaks began to appear suggesting the king was being misled by foreign advisors, an attempt to seed doubts was felt about royal impartiality. But it backfired spectacularly. Within hours, royal aides released a subtle yet devastating clarification through an unnamed source. His Majesty's views are his own, and they are formed by fact, not persuasion. That line was surgical. It cut through every lie the government tried to weave, leaving Starmer politically bleeding. By dusk, the mood inside Parliament had turned apocalyptic. Opposition MPs waved printouts of leaked ledgers on live television, shouting that Starmer's silence was an admission of guilt. The Speaker struggled to restore order as chants of resign thundered through the chamber. Outside, flares lit up the London sky. Protesters carried banners reading 2.4 billion lies, and Britain belongs to the people. Television crews filmed clashes between riot police and crowds near Trafalgar Square, while commentators muttered about the beginning of the end. And through it all, Buckingham Palace remained silent. No confirmation, no denial, no correction. Just a single flag flying over the palace roof, unmoved by the chaos below. Because the truth was no longer in doubt. The king knew, the people knew, and now even Starmer knew that his time was running out. But if the monarchy has truly taken its stand, if the king has already chosen principle over politics, then what will happen when that truth is spoken aloud in front of Parliament itself? By the following day, Britain was no longer functioning like a country. It was moving like a rumour. Every news bulletin, every late night broadcast, every whispered conversation in cafes and taxi queues circled back to the same unthinkable phrase, King Charles has spoken. Nobody had heard the full statement yet, but fragments were already leaking online, clipped, distorted, and replayed 1,000 times. What emerged was unmistakable. The king had privately condemned the £2.4 billion housing scandal as a moral failure of governance. Those words, simple yet seismic, were all it took to set off the biggest political quake since the 1970s. Within hours, 2 more cabinet ministers resigned, citing irreconcilable ethical differences. The government's majority was gone. The nation's faith had shattered. Inside number 10, panic had replaced policy. Staffers were shredding documents. Aides spoke in code. Senior advisors moved meetings to off-site venues to avoid internal leaks. The Prime Minister's car now travelled with tinted windows and an additional police escort, not for security, but to avoid the cameras that followed him like vultures. Starmer's eyes, once confident and sharp, were described by an insider as haunted, furious and hollow, because deep down, he knew. This was no longer just a political crisis, it was an identity crisis for Britain itself. The system that once prided itself on transparency now looked like a machine built to protect thieves. In Parliament, tension rose to a fever pitch. A special emergency session was called after opposition MPs demanded the King's statement be read into record. The chamber was overflowing. Journalists, diplomats, and even former MPs packed the gallery. Then, in a voice that trembled just slightly under the weight of history, the Speaker read aloud the line that would define the decade. The duty of governance is not to enrich the few, but to protect the many. When that duty is betrayed, the people are left sovereign. Gasps filled the hall. It wasn't just a royal observation, it was an earthquake in the foundation of democracy. Some MPs applauded, others shouted, "Constitutional overreach!" But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The Crown had drawn its moral line in the sand. By the afternoon, global markets reacted as if war had been declared. The pound tumbled, investors panicked, and international broadcasters ran banners reading, "Britain in constitutional crisis." European leaders called for calm, while Washington expressed concern. But for millions of ordinary Britons, this wasn't crisis. It was vindication. They'd been told for years that the system was fair, that corruption was just a myth of conspiracy. Now the king himself had confirmed their worst fears. The government wasn't just incompetent, it was complicit. Protests turned into pilgrimages. From Glasgow to Portsmouth, people gathered outside royal landmarks holding candles and flags. One banner captured the mood perfectly. The Crown spoke because Parliament wouldn't. In Manchester, veterans marched in silence, medals pinned proudly, carrying signs that read, "We served, they stole." Outside Buckingham Palace, the air buzzed with both reverence and rebellion. Some came to thank the king, others came to plead with him to go further. In every direction, the same chant rolled like thunder through the night as "Save our Britain." And yet, amid the public uproar, Starmer's strategy turned darker. Leaked memos revealed that Downing Street had begun preparing a royal constraint motion. A legal manoeuvre designed to remind the palace of its constitutional limits. Essentially, an attempt to muzzle the monarchy. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. A prime minister accused of corruption, trying to silence the one figure calling for integrity, but it showed just how desperate his office had become. In closed-door briefings, civil servants warned that invoking constitutional power against the king would be political suicide. Starmer didn't care. Power, once tasted, is rarely surrendered willingly. Then came the breaking point. Late that evening, footage emerged from inside a private parliamentary committee, somehow recorded, somehow leaked. It showed a heated exchange between Starmer and one of his senior ministers. The minister, visibly shaking, said, "We can't hide this anymore. The king has the files. It's over," to which Starmer replied, cold and defiant, "Then we'll burn the rest." Within minutes, the clip spread across every social media platform, watched by millions. Hashtags like #BurnTheRest and #KingVerStarmer trended worldwide. By nightfall, London was no longer a capital city. It was a battlefield of narratives. On one side, the monarchy's quiet dignity. On the other, a government clawing to rewrite the ending. Police erected barricades around Whitehall, but the crowds kept coming. The air smelled of rain, smoke and defiance. Outside Parliament, an elderly man wrapped in a flag told a reporter, "When the king speaks truth, the people listen. And when the people listen, no government can silence them." His voice cracked, but his words echoed what millions now felt. This wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. But deep inside the palace, sources whispered of something even more shocking. It's a sealed document prepared by royal legal advisors outlining what would happen if the Prime Minister refused to step down. A constitutional blueprint never meant to see daylight. And if that document exists, if the king truly intends to use it, then Britain isn't heading toward an election. It's heading toward a reckoning. As dawn broke over Westminster, the air felt heavier than ever before, the kind of silence that comes not before chaos, but after the realisation that chaos has already begun. The streets surrounding Parliament were cordoned off, the royal standard fluttered motionless over Buckingham Palace, and for the first time in living memory, the Crown and the government stood in open confrontation. The King's message was out, undeniable, unfun, and unstoppable. Every newspaper splashed the same headline across its front page. "The monarch speaks, duty betrayed." It wasn't just words, it was a declaration. Britain's oldest institution had called out its newest deceit. Inside number 10, panic had turned to paralysis. Advisors no longer spoke freely. Cabinet ministers arrived one by one, each leaving sooner than expected. Some walked out with resignation letters in hand, others stayed, clinging to power like passengers on a sinking ship. Starmer himself hadn't been seen publicly in nearly 24 hours. Rumours swirled that he was preparing a televised address. But as hours passed, broadcasters filled airtime with speculation and silence. When power hides, the people notice. And when the people notice, history starts to move. By noon, Westminster Hall was overflowing with reporters, MPs and security officers. The Speaker had called for an emergency inquiry session, one that would determine whether the Prime Minister still held the confidence of Parliament. The atmosphere was electric, tense, almost ceremonial. Then, in an unexpected move, the Clerk of Parliament announced that a sealed envelope had been delivered directly from Buckingham Palace. Inside was a short, typed letter signed by King Charles himself. Its contents were brief but devastating. "This nation's strength lies in its integrity. Leadership that abandons integrity abandons its right to lead. The chamber fell silent. Some MPs clapped, others bowed their heads. The meaning was clear. The king had drawn the final line. Outside, the reaction was instantaneous. Crowds swelled again, but this time the mood was different. Less rage, more resolve. There were tears, cheers, prayers. Church bells rang in several towns, not for celebration, but for change. Television footage showed veterans standing side by side with students, nurses with policemen, all holding signs that read, "Stand with the Crown." It wasn't about royalty anymore. It was about redemption. For a moment, Britain felt like it was remembering itself. Inside Downing Street, the clock ran out. A no confidence vote was called. The numbers, once shielded by party loyalty, now told a different story. Dozens of Labour MPs broke ranks, crossing the floor as the tally was read. The Prime Minister's majority collapsed in real time. And in that single moment, in the echo of that final count, the man who once promised to rebuild Britain became the symbol of its decay. Witnesses said Starmer sat motionless, staring straight ahead as if waiting for a script that never came. Then came the breaking sound, the roar outside, the chant that refused to die. For Britain! It grew louder with each minute, rolling down Whitehall like thunder. Windows rattled, cameras shook, and somewhere beyond the chaos, the bells of Westminster tolled 12. Starmer rose slowly, turned to his aides, and walked out through the back corridor of Parliament, flanked by police. No words, no farewell, just the long shadow of a man leaving power behind. But even as the Prime Minister's car vanished into the London mist, the story wasn't over. Across the nation, celebrations began to mingle with unease. Was this justice or the beginning of something even greater? Reports surfaced that several senior officials had already been detained for questioning regarding the Westbridge contracts. Investigators unearthed offshore transfers, false invoices, hidden accounts, each revelation more damning than the last. The £2.4 billion scandal wasn't just corruption, it was contagion, infecting every department it touched. By evening, the King addressed the nation in a live broadcast, calm, steady, but unflinchingly clear. He spoke not of triumph, but of duty. "We must remember that power is a trust, not a trophy," he said. "This country will rebuild its honour, not through vengeance, but through truth." It was the kind of speech that history books are built around. Gentle in tone, yet powerful enough to move a nation. The crowds listening outside the palace fell silent, many in tears. For the first time in years, the word Britain didn't sound broken, and yet beneath the hope, one question lingered. One that neither the king nor the people could answer just yet. What happens now? Can a country stripped of faith in its leaders truly rebuild that faith again? Because while the corruption has fallen, the cracks it left behind still run deep. Through Parliament, through politics, through the hearts of millions who once believed in the system, the King's words echoed through the night, reaching every home, every heart, every conscience. We are Britain and we remember. But remembering is not the same as forgiving. The palace lights dimmed, Parliament stood empty, and the crowd's chants faded into the cold London air. The monarchy had spoken, the government had fallen, but the truth had only just begun to speak.